Todd would know. How many golf courses are there in St. George?
Probably about 12, I think.
Wow.
Not near enough.
My feeling exactly. I just wish I could get better at it, you know. I've been golfing for about 15 years, and it's like I don't know. Have a good day, and then all of a sudden I'm back to my same old bad habits the next time I go.
There's Mark. So we're just missing Andy and
Andy and Randy.
we just need one of them to start, don't we?
Actually, we could start with the three.
Can we?
Three, so.
Is quorum a 3?
Yep.
Oh, come on, Mark. I expected to see you in your car.
I should have been, but it's 104 out today. So I took the Cowards Road out here.
Give it 1 minute is what we'll do. It's right at 5 here. You see, there's Randy right there.
Cool.
Give him a second to connect and
Hello.
all righty. All righty. Let's get started. Thank you everybody for being at this September Power Board meeting. We're still going Zoom right now, so we're all in different locations. I know we've got some guests, so I think I'm going to turn it real quick over to Rick just to introduce our guests.
Yeah, we've got Mark Beauchamp with us that'll present the impact fee study and the rate. And he's done a great job, and you've done it at least
3-4 times.
before.
Yeah.
I know that. So be nice to him, but he'll have a lot of good information for you. So
Let me
All right. Jeremy's hiding behind the scenes there.
there we go. On the right one.
I am hiding, but I'm still here. So
Okay. And David,
yeah, Mark.
There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
we can, yeah.
Okay, good. I think that most of you are not familiar with myself or Utility Financial Solutions. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit.
Oh, wait,
about-
Mark.
Yep.
Mark, I'm gonna stop you just for a second, just so we can get rid of some other business and stay to the agenda
Okay.
before you get started. So first off, everybody had a chance to review the agenda. Does everything look okay? Any questions on that?
Looks good.
Yeah, I didn't have any questions.
Okay, if we have a motion to pass the agenda in a second.
I'll go ahead and
I'll
motion
second
to approve the agenda.
Okay.
I'll second.
Okay, so Todd motioned and Mark seconded. Randy, do you want to start us on a vote?
Meyer, aye.
Todd,
Spriggs, aye.
Mark,
Hauser, aye.
Dinsmore, aye. Okay. Minutes, the August minutes. I'm just switching screens here. Any questions on that?
No questions here. Looks good to me.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the things we were covering today that we carried over, anything there. So
Yeah,
no questions. Can we get a motion and a second for that?
Motion to approve.
Okay.
I'll second.
So Randy did the motion and Mark did the second. So Todd,
Spriggs, aye.
Randy,
Meyer, aye.
Mark,
Hauser, aye.
and Dinsmore, aye. So let me get out of that one. Okay, so we've got new business now. So Rick, do you want to take over here real quick and then turn the time to Mark?
Or Mark, can I get you to unshare your screen for a sec so I can do mine?
Yeah, sorry about that. I jumped the gun.
No, you're good.
Let's see if I can find what I need. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So the first step in the impact fee process is to develop an impact fee facilities plan. And if you remember back in February, we approved the Power Board recommended to the council, and the council adopted basically a 5, and parts of it actually were a 10-year capital facilities plan. It included facilities both that qualified for impact fees and facilities that didn't. And so this impact fee facility plan is a subset of that larger plan, but basically a lot of the same information's there. The main difference, the impact fee here on this second section, impact fees must only be used to fund improvements that are associated with growth. So we can't use those funds for maintenance or operation costs, things like that. So I wasn't planning on, this was sent out, wasn't planning on, unless you guys have specific questions, a lot of time on the impact fee facility plan. But basically the first part, it just goes through and gives kind of a general background. So if people not familiar with the power system read it, hopefully they can get a little better understanding of what the fee's trying to do and what it represents. And these tables are the same that was in that original study. And I just want to get to kind of the meat and potatoes of things. This table here in the back are the projects. And then in the column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column over, it shows how much of that project is qualifies for impact fees. And they'll vary from 0 to 100% depending on what they were. And this was from the original capital facilities plan. And so when Mark talks about the cost to recover what's needed for the impact fee projects, this is the table that he's referring to, or where the cost that he was given came from. Comes from this study, which again is a subset or correlated very closely with the larger capital facilities plan. And then also I'll back up just a little bit too. On all 3 of these items, we're planning on presenting them to you tonight. You've had them for a few days. And then next month is when we would look for a motion to recommend to the council. And then the council will, assuming you guys have a positive recommendation, the council would take those up, or it'll be on the agenda for the October 13th agenda for the city council. So any questions on the impact fee facilities plan? Again, it's the projects that feed into the study that Mark did for us. And if there aren't any questions, I will unshare. And then I think we'd be ready for Mark to present actually both studies. I'm not sure which order he was planning on going, but it could work either way.
But what I'm going to do is to first go through, we did, in a sense, 2 sets of studies. We did the electric cost of service study, and that incorporates or does a 5-year financial projection and looks at how you're projected financially, how much cash you're projected to have, what your debt coverage ratio is. I'll go in and explain these targets, how your operating income is going to look. And we do look over a 5-year period. And I will say this, you guys are extremely financially healthy, and we're not recommending any rate increases at all. You have adequate cash reserves. Your low debt utility is 17% debt to equity ratio. And what that means, the average utility similar to Washington City is about 35% debt to equity. You're at 17%, so real low debt utility. Then we also look at things like the age of your infrastructure, and the average system, of course, is about 50% depreciated. You're only at 30%. So because of your growth and stuff, you have a lot of new infrastructure. So from that standpoint, you're in good shape. You'll see your cash reserves are good. They will be declining because of your capital plans, but you're in very good shape on a cash basis, of course, debt coverage basis. We also looked at the cost of service results. We've been doing cost of service studies for about 10 years for Washington City. And as part of that, we look at how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers. And there are some variations, and you'll see that in the results, but you're pretty close. Overall, you're close. There's no cost of service study. No utility in the country charges 100% cost of service based rates. You just want to get in the ballpark or relatively close. And the way the study is showing, you're very close in most of your main classes. We also look at the monthly customer charge, what that fixed monthly customer charge should be. And then the other part of the study that we did is the impact fee analysis. And I'm going to go through how we looked at it and what the results were. So as I go through this, please stop and ask any questions. I do want to start by just telling you a little bit about myself and Utility Financial Solutions, because I don't think that many of you were on the power board the last time we did this study. And Utility Financial Solutions was formed in 2001. And we've done work in 44 states, including some international work in the Caribbean, islands of Guam, Barbados, Bermuda. I think we've done work in, 44 states. We also teach cost of service courses for the American Public Power Association, as well as financial planning courses. And we teach classes for the American Gas Association and also for the American Water Works Association. So with that, again, as I go through, please stop and ask any questions you might have. So the very first thing is, and probably in my opinion, the most important thing is the long-term financial projection, because that looks at the financial health of the utility, what it currently looks like, and what it's projected to look like. But of course, when you build a projection, the projection is built on assumptions. And this is a list of the significant assumptions we use in the modeling. The first one is the annual inflation rate. And we assumed a 2.2% inflation rate. That'd be on labor, materials, supplies. Obviously with COVID, recently we've seen inflation upwards of 5%, but it is projected to come back down to its historical norm of around that 2.2 level. So that's what we assumed in the projection. The growth rate, this we received from UAMPS, and we're a pretty healthy growth rate, a little over around 3% per year growth rate for Washington City between 2021 and 2025. The power supply cost, we assumed a 3% increase annually in power supply cost. Now, I got to say something that probably sounds kind of funny, but power supply doesn't affect your financials, at least not directly or not in the long term. And the reason it doesn't is because of a power cost adjustment that you have. And I'm going to go through how that power cost adjustment is determined as part of this presentation. Then the capital improvement plan, that's funded through revenue. You can see it's about $1 million a year. 2025, because of a substation, goes about $4.4 million. So is there any questions about the assumptions that we use in building the model? Okay. Now, what I want to go through next are those 3 key financial targets. There's a lot of different targets we look at, but there's 3 main ones that we use to assess the financial condition of the utility. And the first one is something called debt coverage ratio. And most electric utilities in the United States issue what's called revenue bonds, which are different than general obligation bonds. They're typically issued by the general fund of a city. General obligation bonds are secured by the property taxes of the community. Revenue bonds are secured by the revenues of the electric utility. So because of that, it comes with certain bond covenants that you have to maintain. And the key one is something called debt coverage ratio. In the bond ordinance, there's like a 1.2 coverage ratio requirement. If you fall below that, you're actually in violation of your bond covenants, technical default on the debt. Not that somebody's gonna come on knocking on your door demanding payment, but it can affect future bond ratings. So what we do is to help ensure that you don't fail coverage, we add a safety factor. In this case, we increase the bond covenant to 1.4 in our modeling, because electric sales are dependent on weather, plus catastrophic events happen. So we want to make sure that you have that safety factor built in. So our minimum coverage ratio is 1.4. And your projected coverage is well above that. So it's 3 times coverage. I mean, you have no issue with it at all. Just so you know how debt coverage is calculated, I'll go through this. It looks at the cash that's generated purely from your operations. Doesn't include capital, it's just your operating cash flows. It takes that operating cash flow, divides it by your debt service payment. That's what gives it that coverage. And you can see we have a minimum of 1.4. We're actually calculating 3.2, so you're in great shape. And of course, that's partially because you're a low debt utility at 17%. The second key target we look at is minimum cash. What we're trying to answer here is how much cash does the utility need to maintain in reserves at a minimum? All right. And primarily what we look at is working capital lag. And what working capital lag is the timing difference between when you pay a bill. For example, you might go all through the month of January, paying for labor, materials, supplies. But you don't read the meters. Say you have one billing cycle. So you read all the meters at the end of January, send all the bills out the month of February. You don't get that money from your customers till the 2nd or 3rd week of March. So there's a timing difference between when you paid the bill and get that money from customers. And that working capital lag has to be in your reserves at all times so that you have the money to pay bills in a timely fashion. Now, for any utility that bills on a monthly basis, the working capital lag is 45 days, typically, between when you paid the bill and get the money from customers. So if you see this 12.3% right here, all that is the 45 days of working capital lag divided by 365 days in a year. That's 12.3%. So we take your operating expenses, we take 12.3% of it, that comes up to 661,000. So we have to make sure that's in our reserves to pay for those bills. The second item is purchase power cost. Now there's 2 things associated with purchase power costs that are different. One is the working capital lag is different. In other words, you may go all through the month of January, the UAMPs, you may read your meter at the end of the month, send you a bill the 1st week of February, and you pay the bill at the end of February. So you get the money from customers the 2nd or 3rd week of March. So the working capital lag is greatly reduced. However, your purchase power costs on a month-to-month basis vary substantially. So we want to calculate the purchase power working capital on that highest purchase power bill that occurs throughout the year. So we did the calculation, came out to 1.1 million that we need to have set aside in our cash for purchase power cost. I'm going to skip over the next one. I'll come back to it. Then we have your debt service payments. You make 2 debt service payments in the course of the year. One is principal and interest, and the other one's interest only. So of course, the principal interest payment is a larger payment. So we want to make sure that largest payment is in your reserves at all times. And that's the 690,000. Then you have your capital improvement program. And what we do here is we take your 5-year capital plan and basically take 1/5 of it, because we want to make sure that at the beginning of any construction season, that you have the cash in your reserves to complete the projects that you have planned. All right. And that's at $1.9 million. Now I'm going to come back to this one, historical rate base. Now what that is bad things happen to our utility. You know, catastrophic events, could be an ice storm, a windstorm. If you're in Florida, it could be a hurricane. And I guess if you're in New York, it could be a hurricane too, right? Anyway, we want to recognize that bad things happen. Now it's kind of subjective. And we don't necessarily want to set aside enough money to fund an entire catastrophic event. We just want to make sure you have money set aside that if something bad happened, that you can do certain projects until adequate financing can be arranged. So what we do to recognize your potential risk is we look at your assets. Remember I said that you're only 30% depreciated. So you have newer infrastructure. And because you have a newer infrastructure, we feel that you have less exposure to a catastrophic event. So we assigned you our lowest risk rating, which is 1% of the historical investment and assets that you made in the system. So, and that adds about 443,000 to your minimum cash reserves. And again, we're just recognizing it. Now, when we look at your projected cash reserves down here, you can see it's about $8 million, drops down to about 6.8 million in 2025. The minimum cash is running about 5 million per year. So you're above the minimum cash reserve requirement that we've identified. So again, this is without any rate changes. So you're financially very good shape. So I know that in many ways, this is probably the most complicated slide I have in the deck. Is there any questions about this slide or how we determine the minimum cash? We consider Washington City a very low risk utility. I mean, you have some risk exposure, but you have a lot of good things going for you to lower your risk. One is the newer infrastructure. You're not in an area where it's probably high risk like a hurricane. You have a purchase power cost adjustment to help you, protect you against fluctuations in power supply costs. Plus you have a certain amount of stability in purchase power cost in your what you own in generation, combined with your entitlements and generation at UAMPS. And you do purchase some from the market, but we feel that what's that?
You see any potential for inflation like we were seeing across other industries in the power?
Power supply costs have been rising, and I'm not kidding you about that. It's driven by a lot of things. I mean, some of it's the renewables, because it isn't the cost of the renewables, it's the intermittency of the renewables. We can't rely upon them. So we have to still have generation assets. And so if something happens to the renewables, we have to fire up the less efficient hard generating units. And so of course, market prices tend to rise, but there's a lot of factors that contribute to it. One is the shutting down of coal facilities. We don't have the same resource mix, stable power supply mix that we used to have around the country. That's all contributing to higher power supply cost. I think that's what's happened in Washington City and in Utah in general, but all around the country. Power supply costs have been rising the last few months. So hopefully that helped answer it. I'm not a power supply engineer. I just know a little bit about the markets because with dealing with the rates. Any other questions about this? Okay. The third target that we look at the way we look at municipals financials, we look at it this way: determining revenue requirements in a sense. The revenue requirements, when I use that terminology, what that means is how much money I should recover from customers through the rates I'm charging. The determination of revenue requirements is not an exact science, and I don't want to kid you that it's this magic number that we pull out of the air. What we do is we look at ranges. We defined a minimum level. That's a minimum debt coverage ratio, the minimum cash reserves. So we have to set rates high enough to maintain those minimums. Then we establish an upper boundary. That upper boundary is the target operating income. We don't like to exceed it. It's okay to get up to it, but we don't like to exceed it. When we set a rate track for utility, we try to maintain between those thresholds, the minimum and the maximum. And the target operating income, what we do here is we look at your assets. And let's say theoretically, this isn't theoretical, it's actually what happens. Let's say that you put a $1 million asset in service and it has a 20-year life. And let's say every year, you put that $1 million asset on the books and you depreciate that asset. And so every year you record $50,000 of depreciation expense. And that represents theoretically how much customers are using and consuming the infrastructure. So it's a little bit different way of looking at things. It's called the utility basis, kind of like an investor-owned utility would look at it. All right, so now let's say theoretically we set aside that depreciation expense every year, that $50,000. So at the end of 20 years, when we go to replace the asset, we have theoretically recovered $1 million to replace it. But when we actually go to replace it, it's going to cost us more than that, because every year the replacement cost of the asset goes up. So what we do is we look at the Handy-Whitman index. We usually use a 20-year average. And electric infrastructure tends to rise about 3.2% annually over the past 20 years. So higher than inflation. So theoretically then, what this target is trying to do is to say at the end of 20 years, that $1 million asset, we need to set aside $32,000 additional every year so that when we go to replace that $1 million asset, we have the funds to replace it. Okay, it's a theoretical calculation. And it becomes our upper boundary. It's what we define as a break-even rate of return, which is about 4 to 4.5% for Washington City. If you're an investor in utility, it'd probably be 8 to 11%. But again, that's our upper boundary and that's our break-even rate of return. Is there any questions about this or about this target? Okay. Does it make sense the way we're looking at it so far? Right, now, this slide summarizes those three targets. So again, this is without any rate changes. Debt coverage ratio, great shape. Minimum cash reserves of 4 to 5 million. Projected cash balances, we're exceeding it. Target operating income is about 1.2 to 1.6 million. We're running about 600 to 700,000 annually. Again, we're not exceeding it. We're in the middle of it. When I look at this financially, you guys are in great shape. So we're not recommending any rate increases or any rate changes. And I'll get into that in the next section. So, which is the cost of service piece. Now, is there any questions about the financials? Now, the cost of service study, this is probably, this is far more complex part of our study. The financial projection is something, it's more, I won't say routine, but it's easier to do. The cost of service study, what it does is it looks at how customers use electricity, when they use it, how they use it. It looks at their load profiles or their usage profiles. And it looks at how Washington City's costs occur when they occur. In other words, the demand charges that you pay for power supply or transmission. When are those peaks determined, and how much is Washington City, who's using energy at the time of those peaks? Is it residential, commercial, industrial? And it then identifies who's responsible for contributing to those demands. And it does the same thing with the distribution infrastructure, in that it looks at, you have the substations, and looks at how much substation capacity is theoretically needed for an average residential customer, or for a typical commercial load profile, or industrial load profile. And it allocates the substation costs based on what their peak demands are on that substation. It does that for every component of the system. And that then becomes the cost of service. So for like residential, it costs Washington City about $10.6 million a year. The money we receive, or the projected revenues from the class, is about 10.1 million. So to fully meet cost of service requirements, we would need a 5.3% rate increase. Now, I look back, I think it was around 2010 when I first started working for the city of Washington, and I think that the residential showed like a 15% increase was needed. And we've slowly over time gave residentials a little bit more of an increase than like the large commercial. And a large commercial showed like a 10 or 12% reduction was needed back then. So what's happened over the last 10 years with the rate changes that have been made, we've tightened up the cost of service studies. So these look a lot closer than they used to. And the average increase to fully meet that target operating income, we would need a 4.6% increase. Look at residentials, we're really just right at the average. I mean, it's almost right at the average of 4.6. The small commercial, 3.7, again, really close to the average. A large commercial shows a 5.1% reduction theoretically. But most of these are within the bandwidth or the threshold of the differentials between where most cost of service studies, our target threshold is about 10%. So up from the average. So you're really within that 10% range from the averages. Your steel structures, which is a primary metered account, it kind of has an unusual load profile for a primary metered. It's what we call low load factor. And what low load factor, first, I know it's a small account, but I think it's good to understand the difference between steel structures and the other customers in your system. Primary metered is a customer that owns your own transformer, all right? Where most of your customers, you own the transformer. That's a secondary metered account. And so their rate structures are different. Usually primary metered accounts are reserved for large customers that tend to be more 24-hour day operations. And what 24-hour day operations, what their load profile looks like is flat. In other words, they tend to use energy consistently 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Low load factors, like steel structures, like 35% load factor. And what that means is they don't use energy consistently. They're probably a one shift operations, I'm guessing. I don't know them specifically, but based on the load profile, they tend to indicate that they're a single shift operation, which is not typical of a primary metered account. And I'm hesitant to change this rate structure because it's targeted for somebody with a more typical load profile that's in that 50 to 60% load profile range. And it's such a small account, it's not really worth going through the hassles of a rate change, so to speak, to pick up a couple $1,000s from a customer. So what we're recommending is to leave this alone and to not do any more tweaking. And there's another reason for that too. We're expecting that your profile, your especially on the power supply side, is going to change in the future, especially with the addition of the nuclear plants and the changes in your power supply costs that have occurred the past year. I would, that's going to affect your cost of service then. And because you're so close right now, I think it's best to leave it alone. And then we'll deal with it or any changes in 2 or 3 years when we do the next study. So, of course, that's just my recommendation, but I want your opinion about my assessment of it.
To me, it looks really solid. Again, my only concern is just the unprecedented increase in expenses across the board from the government and the rate of inflation that we've been seeing. I just but it sounds like we're in good financial shape to kind of absorb some of the worst case scenarios of that at this point. And like you said, if we're doing another review in a couple of years from now, then we should be in good shape to absorb the changes that are coming our way.
Yeah. No, I feel very confident in your financials. There is one other thing to remember too, is that even though inflation, the impact that inflation has on electric utilities is relatively modest. Because less than 20% of your cost structure is affected by inflation. Because most of your costs are related to infrastructure or power supply costs. And so, so it has just a very modest impact. I mean, obviously it impacts it, but it isn't a dramatic impact. So I hope that gives you some comfort, because I know I have the same concerns. I mean, we're projecting 2.2% inflation, but March was 5.1%. But
have you had any indication, like from the different administrations that are in power? I've been hearing rumors about different penalties and stuff that are going to be applied to coal producing plants, and if you're not clean energy, that there's going to be some type of a fine or penalty affixed to your power.
That
considered that?
Yeah, that was something that was initially proposed over 10 years ago, and it periodically comes back. The carbon tax, so to speak, it goes by different names, and it has a lot of opposition. And I mean, obviously, it's difficult to predict the future, but I haven't heard that there's been a huge push to reestablish that carbon tax. I think the concern about it historically was that it would be a shift of wealth, so to speak, from other parts of the country to the Northwest part of the country, because the Northwest is primarily hydro. And so the way they had initially established the carbon tax, it would have been a transfer of wealth from basically the Midwest primarily out to the Northwest. So there was concern about that. And with the provisions that were there, I think it's going to hit headwind personally, but I'm not a politician. But I know historically it's hit some headwind on that, trying to get it through.
And I think, obviously we're monitoring that with the assistance of UAMPS. I think there is going to be some form of clean energy legislation or requirements.
Mhm.
Right now, we don't know what those are, and you hear all kinds of from one extreme to the other. I think Mark's right; it'll temper somewhat, but we really don't know what the fallout of that is. I mean, need to be watching this next infrastructure package. Will probably be potentially the first one that we might get an inkling of at least where they're trying to head. But yeah, there's a lot of moving parts in this, and we're continually monitoring it. And if we see something we're not uncomfortable with, there's nothing stopping us from bringing Mark and his group in even quicker to say, are we on track, or do we need to react to something that we're seeing that was unanticipated. So
there is one other thing of note on this slide that I didn't cover, and just to make you aware of this, and this is not unusual. A lot of utilities provide free services to the city or free street lighting. But I just want to make you aware that street lighting that's provided to Washington City is worth about $256,000 a year. Just so you're aware of what it costs the utility to provide that. I'd like to make that councils aware of that, because they see the transfer payments, but they didn't always see the other benefits of owning their own electric utility. And of course, if this was served by an investor-owned utility, the city would have to pay that amount. So now I want to talk about that monthly customer charge, and it's probably one of the least understood parts of our rate, and it's a fixed charge. Every month, the residential customers currently are charged $16.50, even if they don't use any energy. Okay. And what that charge represents is when a customer has a meter installed in their home, as a utility, you had the cost to install that meter. You also have the responsibility to repair it, to replace the meter. Every month you have to read it and send them a bill. You also have the cost of the service drop into the home. Those are fixed costs that do not vary based on consumption. So it's different than say Dunkin' Donuts. They say, well, you don't get charged a fee to walk into Dunkin' Donuts. And that's true. But Dunkin' Donuts makes an investment on behalf of the community. They build a building and hope customers come in. It's different for an electric utility or utility in general, in that when that home is built, we have a specific investment for that customer. We have to extend wire to that customer to get them electricity. And that's that fixed cost that we're trying to recover in that customer charge. Now, there is a portion of it that is controversial, because I only described the cost from the service drop to the home. That home also needs a wire between the substation and the home so that they can get electricity. This is the part that's controversial. How much of that wire should be allocated or put into that customer charge? We use what's called a minimum system analysis. In other words, theoretically, we ask ourselves the question, or try to answer the question, how much would it cost to build a distribution infrastructure if every customer used 1 kilowatt hour of electricity? Whatever that cost is, we try to recover that through the customer charge. Now, obviously, customers don't use 1 kWh, they use more. That amount gets rolled into the usage component. Now, when we calculated this for Washington City, it calculated out at $13.90, very similar to what we've done in the past. I think the very first study we did, it was around $10, and the second one was like $12, and now it's about $14. But several years ago, there was concern about several things, and the customer charge was set at $16.50. And since that time, we've frozen it. We haven't increased it. We've left it there because it was set above the cost of service. Now, by setting the monthly customer charge higher than cost of service, what that means is we don't charge as high of an energy rate. All right, the energy rate is lower and the customer charge is higher. So, and what we're proposing is, again, to keep that $16.50 where it's at, not increase it, not to decrease it either. Eventually it will catch up. So, and you can see most of your customer charges are pretty close to cost of service. So again, we didn't feel that there was a need to go in and do a rate change to have minor tweaks to the customer charge. So we kind of left them alone. That's our recommendation. And we'll look at it again in a few years. You know, you're constantly making investments in infrastructure. And what I'm hesitant to do is to lower this $16.50 and then to have to come back in 2 or 3 years and increase it because of the infrastructure investments that you're making. So I feel it's better just to freeze it and let it catch up, because you know, if you were to do something like lower rates, nobody ever remembers that. But when you go to increase rates, they will remember that. And so it's best to leave them alone unless there's a need to make a change. That's our philosophy. You know, obviously, we're not making the decisions. It's Power Board, it's City Council. But I just wanted your opinion if you agreed with our assessment.
Sounds about right to me.
Now, the power cost adjustment, and I would probably guess that 75% of the utilities across the country use a power cost adjustment mechanism. And what you're trying to do with it is, as your power supply costs change, you have no control over power supply costs, or very limited control. And as power supply costs go up or down, we're in a sense passing the risk on to customers. However, some utilities will do what's called a monthly adjustment. In other words, if the power supply costs go up 1 month, that change is passed on to customers in the next month. If they go down, that change is passed on. Well, the problem with that is the power cost adjustment is going up and down. That causes issues with customers. So what we proposed back in 2016 was a power cost adjustment mechanism that we've been using for about 15 years now. It's a rolling average methodology. It's called a 12-month rolling. And what we're doing is we're kind of sharing the risk between the utility and the customer. So that as power supply costs go up, we're increasing them, but not increasing them the full amount initially. We're only increasing them in the first year by 1/12 of the increase, the first month, the second month, 2/12 of the increase. And we're slowly moving it to try to minimize the month-to-month variations in that power supply cost adjustment. All right, and that's the methodology that we put it in for Washington City back in 2016. I think it was 2017 actually approved.
That was early 2017 when it went into effect.
Yeah. So now the way it was established is each month the power supply cost adjustment is reviewed. It changes every month, but it usually changes in small amounts because it's taking the previous 12 months power supply cost and looking at that averaged cost. So if it goes up substantially in 1 month, it's mitigated by the previous 11 months. So, and this is the way the formula kind of works, is it's basically just back in 2016, We looked at what the power supply costs were. We looked at the kilowatt hours that were sold. We said, okay, your average power supply cost things are a little over 7 cents. And that we rolled into the rates. That's called the base. All right. So any variation from that base, I think it was 7.01 cents, I believe.
I think it's
Any-
7.11, but yeah. basically.
7, yeah. The so any variation from that base gets passed on to customers. So, for example, if in February, we want to determine the power supply cost, we're going to go back to February of 2020 through January of 2021. Those 12 months of power supply cost goes up here. We're also going to look at how many kilowatt hours that we sold or purchased during that same 12-month period. That's going to produce a number. Let's say that that number is 7.31 cents. We take that 7.31 cents, subtract out the base of 7.11 cents, that's recovered in the rates. So the power cost adjustment is a 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's how we determine it. And we've been doing that for about since 2016. Now, one of the things that, because we use a 12-month rolling average, the calculation is not perfect in that what happens is we're using kilowatt hours purchased. All right. We're assigning something called losses to estimate the kilowatt hours sold. All right. Now, we keep track of the variations. In other words, at the end of the month, they enter in the billing data. We recalculate how much power cost we've recovered, and we compare it to what actually spent. And we have this ongoing balance occurring that's been going on since 2016. I believe it rose to about 1.4 million. And then it was a good thing it did, because in the past month, the last couple of months, power supply costs increased substantially. So what we did is we took that over recovery that's accumulated and we rolled it back into the power supply cost calculation to try to mitigate the increase in the PCA. All right. And depending on what it's going to be, because the power supply cost increased, I believe it's around 35% in the months of June and July for Washington City. And of course, that would have had an impact on the customer's PCA that we felt was maybe more than we should allow. So that's why we rolled that 1.4 million back into the power supply cost and basically gave some of that over recovery back. It's their money anyway. So we just gave it back, some of it. I think about 400,000, was it, Rick, in the calculation I recommended?
Yeah, I think we ended up at 5 because we had already implemented it.
Gotcha.
That last email.
Okay. So is there any questions about this? It's actually, in my opinion, one of the best things the utility can do to maintain and ensure its current and future financial stability. Because what we're doing is any changes, it's a cost we don't have much control over. Markets control it. And so we're passing it on to customers. But we are trying to use our cash reserves to mitigate fluctuations. So we're using our cash reserves in the best interest, I feel, of our ratepayers by mitigating the changes. So kind of sharing the risk. Is there any questions about this?
Looks good.
And from my perspective, for what it's worth, I think it's been a really good thing for the city and it's really helped. So
Now the last thing, this is the only area that we're actually changing, and that's the impact fees. And of course, Rick went through the changes that were made as far as not the changes, but the capital plan over the next 10 years. And what we did is we took the capital plan and, if you were to look at past studies, that were done. There was usually in Utah, most studies work like this, in that the rates are calculated, and then they ask the question, do you want to fully recover from customers, new customers, 100%? Then they establish another level that's 75%, another level that's 50%. And other studies I've done, some had it set at 50%, and some at 100, some at 75. That becomes more of a governing body question to do that. We look at it differently in that what I mean by that is we do the same calculations or similar calculations to determine the impact. But we also know that when you add a new customer, there's margin, there's benefit to existing ratepayers from adding them. And because for every kilowatt hour you sell to that customer, there's contribution margin that's generated that benefits all the other ratepayers. That contribution margin is fixed cost recovery, primarily an infrastructure cost that's buried within the rates. So we look at that contribution margin, that fixed cost recovery, and we present value it or look at it over a period of time. And we say, okay, that new customer may have an impact of X, but they provide us value of Y. Right? So it's that difference between their impact and the value they bring that we're trying to recover in the impact fees. So it's kind of a combination of an engineering study combined with a financial analysis, if that makes sense. So that's the theoretical basis upon which we've calculated the impact fees. So before I get into some, at a high level, some of the changes, the one you're looking at now is the worst one. It's 13%. It's the residential. One of the things I do have a slide at the back, which is kind of the survey. Your residential impact fees are on a survey tend to be lower. I think of a survey as something that you look at and say yes, but no, or whatever. But really, it's your rates or your charges should be based on your costs, not necessarily in a survey. But a survey nonetheless is good information, and governing bodies tend to want to know the information. So, and your residential impact fees are on the lower side. I think they're the second lowest of the 5 utilities that were surveyed. And yeah, what's that?
The one that's lower is Hurricane, and they adopted a 75% philosophy, so they didn't fully recover their costs.
Yeah. Now, what we're proposing here is a 13% increase. And it's actually a calculate. It's you want to call it 100%, but it's that impact less that value they bring. So that's the first thing. The second one is the commercial. Now the commercial, I think you were the second highest of the 5, or you're on the higher side anyway. And the study came out and showed that 4% increase was needed when we did the calculations. The residential 3-phase. This is primarily for apartments. Of course, it came out the same as the other residentials at 13%. The commercial, the larger commercial 3-phase, calculated out at 2% increase. And the last one again is even larger commercials, came out at 2%. I do have a survey. Hopefully you can read this. Rick, I think you put it together, your staff.
Yeah, I think as of towards the end of May.
Yeah. So like if you look at the residentials up here, like the 200 amps, about 2,500. And you can see that the only one lower is Hurricane. And of course, the study is showing that they should get a bigger increase. You get to the commercial, like the 200 amp is 4,600. In this case, you're actually the second highest. St. George is the highest. You look at the commercial 3-phase, it's 6,900, and in this case, you're about you're in the middle basically, between the average is 7,800. You're a little less than the average. If you look at the large three-phase, this came out at 16,000. And if you look at this, the only one that you're less than is St. George. So again, you're on the high side. And those show the lesser increase of 2%. Now, like I said, these costs are based on your numbers. I'm not presenting any changes to say we should use a survey number or anything like that. A survey just used for information.
Just good to know where you stand.
Correct.
That's how I look at it. So,
Your numbers make sense. Yeah. So is there any questions at all or concerns or anything, basically? Because the next step, I believe, isn't Rick to go to the city council?
well, we will probably, tonight we're just presenting the next power board meeting in October. We'll ask the power board to make a recommendation to the council, and then on October 13th, that's when the council will hear it.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we do have a little bit of time if questions come up, but that's the current plan unless something changes.
And I know I've covered a lot of information tonight, and don't hesitate to ask questions, ask Rick for clarifications, because like I said, there's a lot of information I threw at you.
Just out of curiosity, how do we compare with other cities of the similar demographics throughout the nation? Are we in line or lower or higher than other utilities?
From a rates perspective,
Yeah.
I'm only speculating because I didn't actually look at the numbers. But just knowing your rates, my feeling is you're probably a little less than the average, residential wise. So.
And unfortunately, in our case, in our area, we are one of the higher ones as far as rates, but you look at it on a bigger perspective, we're very competitive. And again, it's just a unique area that we're in.
Well, this is just, and Rick probably knows far more about than I do, but if you go back 10, 15 years ago, from my understanding, you had made some significant investments in sub-transmission infrastructure that kind of had created upward pressure on your rates and drove them to be higher than the surrounding, other than St. George. And, I just went through and I know that I've increased, we're increasing some other rates in your area for other utilities. Well, you guys are staying stable, and you're staying stable primarily because you basically made the investments 10, 15 years ago. And you're kind of reaping the benefits of it now. It's allowing for you guys to grow. Your impact fees are reasonable. It's all based upon those investments that were made in the past. Rick, I don't know if you agree with me, and I only know from a very high level.
No, that's correct. When the last boom, if you will, took off, the city built, was it 3 substations and transmission line along Telegraph and the loop up across the freeway on 1100. And then the bottom fell out. So they had invested a large amount. And then to this day, we're just actually with this latest surge of growth, recovering the impact fees that built or is going towards building what was built back in 10 years ago, 13 years ago. So, for example, our Sienna Hills sub, when I got here 4 years ago, had about 2 to 3 megawatts on it. This year it had about 9. And so the loads tripled on that sub in 3 years. And so we were able to recover some of those unrecovered impact fee costs in this last year or so. Hope that makes sense.
Well, thank you. That was really informative.
Thank you. And again, if there's any questions at all, in the meantime, before the next meeting, please, don't hesitate to ask Rick to send them to me.
Yeah, Mark's always terrific to help us out. Like I said, when we saw the PCA pressure last month, and he jumped right on it and helped us figure out a way to mitigate it that made sense and stayed within the goals of what the PCA is intended to do.
Okay. All right. Well, anything else? Anything else at all? Okay.
And if we're done with Mark for now, I think he can probably drop off. I doubt you want to stay up late listening to the rest. So.
All right. I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this study again for the city of Washington. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Rick, do you have any comments or anything as far as a follow-up on what he presented?
No, I think he did a terrific job, and he's done a really good job, not only for Washington City, but a lot of the cities in the state of Utah, and like you said, around the country. And I think Todd may have, I think, attended the one presentation he made in Jackson a couple of years ago, or at least his company, and it follows that methodology that was presented then. So.
I did. I think it was a lady that presented that, and it was very informative. A lot of this, I mean, we're not in this business, and so a lot of this is we need to kind of take their opinion as really, them being the professional. But I was very impressed with the presentation in Jackson, so I felt pretty comfortable with what they've given us.
And it gives us as staff comfort as well to have somebody come in from the outside, look at the numbers, make sure what we're seeing is correct. And again, as things change, we're in a kind of dynamic position, and they're really only a phone call away if we have a question or if we need to look at it in more detail. So we plan to keep them on speed dial as things change and go along.
Does anybody else have questions or comments? So, Rick, do we need to talk right now? Do we kind of sit and look at it? And
yeah, I would suggest that I know some of you have read it, some of you may not have. Take this next month. We've got 3 or 4 weeks here. Chew on it, and I may see if Mark can pop in next month just to answer any questions. And at that point is where we would look for a recommendation to the council, not this week or not this month, but next month.
Okay.
And there's a lot there.
I was
dry and boring, and so don't try to do it all at once.
I was actually surprised to see that the commercial we kind of did right when we talked about it years ago, and I was surprised that the residential needs that kind of a jump, but on the impact side. But
you gotta, the way I look at it too, and I guess that might be a comment as well, is our last impact fee adjustment was done in 2013. So if you look at an 8-year period, I'm guessing almost every other cost that we encounter in our lives has went up by at least that. in an 8-year period. So, I mean, you're less than, what is that? Less than 1.5% a year, effectively. And again, we're by far one of the lowest, or the lowest as far as impact fee compared to the other utilities. That's why I put that other together. It's just to give kind of a benchmark. So while it looks like a fairly large number, you know, the 13%, if you look at, it hasn't changed in 13 years, or excuse me, since 2013, in 8 years. It's really, at least from my perspective, shouldn't be a big surprise in that type of time frame.
And that's the cover for new customers, right? That's accounting for new customers. So that's, I agree with that in terms of being able to make back, especially with the growth that's happening here, to be able to make back that money or break even. Does that make sense?
So when a new customer comes in, they pay that fee, and that goes towards building substation transmission lines primarily, and a little bit of the heavier distribution to interconnect those facilities into the existing system. And
so how does that affect current customers? Is there a prorated fee, or is it the same impact fee if they're doing renovations or something like that? If they're adding,
yeah, say if you, in your case, you might have a 200 amp or a 100 amp service on your house, and you want to upgrade it to a 200. Your impact fee would be that the delta between the two, or based on 100.
Okay.
So it's only on the increase, and it's based on the main breaker size on your service.
I've only asked because I've done that before. So,
but yeah, if you're not making any change to your service, or if you change it out for the same size, there is no impact fee or no change.
okay.
It's just
Thank you. Yeah. And I think the study speaks to you, Rick, and the power board before me, I guess, and the company in general, the city in general. So I think it's great that the finances are where they are, and that the projections are where they are. So kudos to you guys.
And I have to even, pass that along before my predecessor as well. I know there was, and Mike can address that, I think there was a fair amount of pain when they implemented the last rate increase and the PCA and all those kind of things, but it's really showing the benefits of doing that. So while it was difficult then, I think we're seeing the benefits of it now. Of that foresight.
That's great.
I think Mike's about the only one left from that vintage.
I think I am. Everybody's gone from that. Well, okay. If everybody will kind of look at that, if you have any questions, I'd say let's email Nikki and just kind of get it, since we really shouldn't discuss it without being in public forum. But then we can just have a list of all the questions as we go through that. To give you a little bit, I mean, I like the fact that we really are okay on our fees. I kind of look just like with Randy. I concern on the inflation and increased costs that we're seeing across other industries and stuff, and hope that if we do that impact, that's going to cover that kind of an issue. I know we all want to look at our crystal ball on that one, but that's my thoughts on it and stuff. But let's look through those numbers, and we'll get together and talk about that in the next meeting, and go from there.
That's a good idea. If we can get those questions, email them, and then we can get them to Mark, and he could probably pop in for a few minutes next month and answer those, address those, especially if he has them in advance. Pretty easy.
Okay. All righty then. On to the next regular business. Rick, again, back to you.
Okay, well, I'll make my general reports fairly quick. as far as on our system itself, kind of outside of the UAMP side of things, where the building department keeps reporting they're processing building permits at a record-breaking pace pretty much every month. That's not a shock. I don't think anybody on this Zoom call. We're working with the developers in Sitla to find a new substation site up by Exit 8. That's the bigger expense that's shown in 2025. And again, along that with a question that Mark had earlier today, if the development comes in faster, we may have to accelerate some of those projects. But if that happens, the impact fees should come in faster than anticipated too. They should hopefully match fairly close timing wise. Fortunately, we do have some capacity in the existing system, so we don't have to be quite in the same boat that they were in 2007-8 when they invested with those, and then the development didn't happen for a while. So, but that'll be our next largest investment, will be that substation, and we're working with Sitla and those developers up there to find a home for that. Nobody wants to see it, but they all need it. So it's an age-old challenge for us. So, our August peak was just under 46 megawatts. And again, as Mark mentioned, our June and July wholesale power costs were quite high, on average about $90 a megawatt hour. August, I suspect, will be similar. And then as we speak today, these peak hours right now with the heat, Jake just popped his head in before the meeting started and noted that UAMPS was the peak prices for the last hour, and the next couple were about 200. That should be short-lived with the peak or the heat that we're seeing for a couple of days. So normally we wouldn't run the generators in September, but we're running them today and tomorrow. And then we just do a day-by-day basis on if it makes sense economically to run those. So, but since we have the generators, they have saved us some money this last summer by quite a bit. And kudos to Jake and Mike that worked really hard on, particularly June and July. They ran almost every day with the exception of, I think, 3 days in June and 5 days in August. So, or excuse me, in July. The crews have been working on, balancing loads, kind of get ready for, we're starting even to do that to get ready for the peak load next year. We have had a couple interesting ones. If I can share my screen correctly, I think that's the right one. Let's see. We had this happen on 300 South. It was with a little bit of a storm. It was interesting. I talked to the crews, and Tyler made the comment that if he was just to have looked at the pole from the outside, he wouldn't have suspected this being a problem pole. But when it came down and they could see what happened at the break, the termites and critters had got up in the middle, and basically the pole was hollow and had just left the outside shell. Fortunately, there was no serious problems other than obviously replacing the pole. But this came down fairly slow, they suspect, and this conductor here on the top of the picture was actually still energized. And so it goes back to all of the training of everybody. If you see a down power line, stay away, because this was actually energized until the crews got there and were able to de-energize it. The fire department got down there quickly and kind of barricaded off the area until we were able to get people in there. This happened on a Friday night, and the next Saturday, we had a car hit the transformer over by Don Pedro's. And what it did, it hit the transformer, shifted it, and you can see the oil spilling out of this secondary bushing. And it slid it over and damaged the cables going in and out of it, so they all had to be replaced. And again, our crews were more than willing to come in and spent quite a bit of the night replacing the transformer and the cables in that area. That was the car. I didn't include the picture of the open beer container inside the car, but it was fairly obvious the cause of that accident. So
when they have to replace those cables, do they replace the entire cable, or do they just a section of it?
They're in conduit, so we have to replace it to the next device back. And so in these cases, we have the insurance information, and their insurance company will get billed for all that work. So the crews have been doing, and it's kind of be a theme for this year, doing a lot of the smaller maintenance. You may have seen them up on Graham Manor. We replaced a section of overhead with an underground piece there as well. Give you a report on a couple of the things that have been recently that you guys were involved with. Approval, the renewable resource guide documents now on the website. The medical alert program update is on the website. Let's see, what else did Wayne have? We did have a break into our yard, and so we're working on getting some more security cameras in there. There was a couple people that got in. They took some copper, and we found out a few days later they also got a concrete saw that was in the back of one of the trucks. So we're working on improving security out here. On the generator side, I reported that for the most part, runs should be fairly minimal, but they have repaired some oil and coolant leaks that developed over the summer. And again, overall, the generators have run quite well this summer. Any questions? We've ordered the material for rebuilding the line that goes. It's on the east side of Cactus Lane. That's one of our major double circuit feeds that needs some repair. It's kind of like 100 South got. It's just time to upgrade that. So we're working on getting the materials in, and then we'll start seeing crews out there. I'm guessing it'll be a month or two before we get all the materials in. So speaking of materials, just an interesting side note, we've recently found out that distribution transformers, like by your house that supplies your homes, some of the manufacturers are over a year out on lead times on those materials. So fortunately, we do have a good stock. We're primarily stocking for maintenance purposes, not new construction. So I think we went back and looked over the last year and a half, and I think we're in good shape. But we didn't place an order for a few more transformers, but they were 6 to 7 months out before we'll see those. So, but like you said, we've talked. There's a lot of pressure on different things and pricing. We haven't seen crazy pricing spikes on the high voltage materials, but who knows, the hurricanes don't help that. When you see those white areas, just get wiped out, it's gonna use up a lot of the inventory that's available. Shifting to UAMPS items, the UAMPS had their annual meeting in Squaw Valley, August 15th to 18th. And I don't know, Todd, do you want to give maybe a brief report, and then they don't have to listen to me on that one? Put you on the spot a little bit.
It was smoky.
Yes, it was.
But yeah, I think the speakers and presenters were very good. A wide range of topics that they spoke on, from fraud to natural disasters, all kinds of stuff, and very informative. It's eye-opening to go to something like that because you see all the things that can happen and all that goes into providing power, and it's not exclusive to us. Everyone goes through has these issues. I thought it was interesting that he said that we are kind of a low risk area, and you hear, like we heard from Texas, the freezing and everything that occurred in Texas, and it just makes you grateful for where we live, and it's really nice to be in those low risk areas. And it's good to see that we have the stability that we do have, because we take it for granted. But then you go to these conventions and you hear some of these stories and things, and you realize, it's really not that smooth in other areas. So I think Rick and I think UAMPS does a great job, and very informative.
Good. Yeah. So I felt the same way. There were good meetings. They talked about what we briefly discussed, what could be some of the carbon tax or clean resource legislation. Of course, nobody has a definitive answer on that, but it's definitely something everybody's keeping an eye on and trying to figure out what those boundaries might be. So, I don't know, Jeremy, do you have anything you want to add on that at the UAMPS meetings?
No, I don't think so. It was really good. Quality meetings, and I got to spend some time with Rick and Todd and others. So those are always beneficial relationship building times as well. So I got to see Todd in person, not just digital Todd, which is what I normally see. He is a real person for those of you who haven't met him.
And he got to see how poor of a golfer I am as well.
Well, I wasn't going to bring that up. I think we all had our share of rough shots, but it was fun anyway.
It was fun.
Okay, just give you a quick report on the other UAMPS projects. On the Central St. George project, probably the main thing there to report on is on September 29th, the area utilities have their, we meet twice a year in the spring and in the fall, one before the summer and one after the summer. So they'll, Rocky Mountain and others will present the post-peak report, is what they call it, where we kind of analyze where did the system peak hit and what does that hold for the future kind of thing. So hopefully next month we'll have a little better report. I can share with you the results of that study. On the Payson Nebo generating plant project, it's been running well. Fortunately, it's run, I think the month of July was one of the few months it's actually ran 24/7. The output did go up and down a little bit based on needs, but it did run the full month. However, starting early next month in October, they'll actually be shutting the plant down for a major maintenance cycle. What they're going to be doing is replacing the control system that's been in place since the plant was built. And, they can't even get parts for some of the computer electronic parts for it. It's no longer supported, and so they're upgrading that. So that plant will be out. The plan is for 6 weeks, so from early October to mid-November. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that maybe they can moving along quicker. They've tried to do a lot of prep with the manufacturer of the new control system. So hopefully it'll go smooth and maybe surprise us to go faster than as anticipated. One other fact on that project is UAMPS is beginning to look a little bit, talked with different suppliers and manufacturers of what role, if any, hydrogen could be at that plant, either as a mix with the natural gas. Again, looking forward to what this clean energy standard could bring. And so they're trying to get ahead of that a little bit and identify if it could even be used and what it would take to get to that point. So no specific answers on that, but they are looking at, how can we extend the life of that plant in the future. The Vail plant, unfortunately, had a major oil leak in the generator on the main bearing. And so it's been offline for, I think, 3 weeks now. Originally, it wasn't going to be back till December. However, they did find a different repair shop in Phoenix. And so they're going to be removing it from the site next week on the 14th and hope to have it back online by mid-October. So that'll cut that outage on that plant by about half. And it was a leak that's been there for a while, kind of slow. But a few weeks ago, it went from slow to where it couldn't be tolerated and had to shut the unit down to prevent any damage to the bearings. So we've already talked a little bit about for the Government and Public Affairs project. Probably the biggest thing going on is the legislation that's being proposed. The one bill did make it through the Senate. They're waiting on the House to approve it. Then the Democrats look like they are pursuing a Democrat-only additional spending bill, and that's the one where they suspect there'll be some form of clean energy requirement that may be in that. They anticipate it to include also human infrastructure or social programs, electric vehicle charging, and some transmission funding. So again, keeping an eye on that. There's not a lot of details, so it's hard to react to things that we don't know a lot about. But so far, the small modular reactor support is still there, again, on both the Senate and the House and on both sides of the aisle. So that's a good thing for the carbon-free project. Of course, the drought on the hydro production, as Mark mentioned, the Northwest is heavily in the, hydro. And so any production loss of that hydro can affect power pricing across the Western United States. So again, that's a concern. And so pray for moisture all over. The meetings, the board meetings were actually kind of abbreviated in Squaw Valley. So on a lot of the projects, there wasn't a lot to report. The Red Mesa and the Steel Solar projects are still both on target. For the Red Mesa should be on, we're hoping for summer of next year. And then the Steel Solar would come on towards December of next year. We're waiting on getting more details on the Enchant. That's the carbon sequestration project on the San Juan power plant. We did show interest in some additional capacity in that, at least from now up or next year up till 2030 when the CFPP would be on. Again, a lot of the details still have to be worked out. We're hoping that we'll see those pretty soon. Nothing to update on the Photo Sol solar project or the Muddy Creek However, we are evaluating, there's a steel solar project 2 that's out there, which would be constructed adjacent to the first steel solar. And I actually have a call with UAMPS tomorrow to kind of look at that. I suspect we'll probably at least go through the study part of that project, and maybe a 2 or 3 megawatt level. I know last time at our last meeting, I think it was Randy or maybe Todd, one of you had asked the question, should we be a little more aggressive on some of the solar projects? And this is an opportunity that's come up since then that we can sign up for potentially some more there. So there's, Jake and I counted today, there's 6 different study projects. I don't know that we need them all, and they all each have pros and cons. And so as some of that flushes out a little better, we'll bring those for a formal recommendation to the council to move forward on those. The pool, again, this summer's been pretty pricey, but I think that's not necessarily a surprise, but it definitely has put some pressure on our costs because of that high price. And the Colorado River is the concern with that is the hydro level. I'm sure everybody's seen Lake Powell and Lake Mead are way down, and it's a big concern. And they're starting to approach where they may not even be able to generate, out of those dams if it gets too much more. So again, hope for a wet winter to bring those up. The wind projects, Horse Butte had a capacity factor of about 22%. Pleasant Valley was only about 11%. So again, wind's a bit of a challenge because you never know what you're going to get there. And last but not least, a quick report on the carbon-free project. The big item on that project is they're working on a revolving line of credit with Bank of America. They're scheduled to close on that the 15th, which would be next Wednesday. And then that'll provide financing mechanism through class 3 estimate, which is September of 22. So about a year from now. But they have started some of the seismic work on the site. They have personnel there. Drilling was scheduled to start August 28th. I assume that happened. I haven't heard different. And then the NRC is scheduled to visit the site in November. Their idea with that is to engage the regulatory agency up front, keep them involved so they know what's going on and are comfortable with the project to help the approval project going forward. UAMPS indicated they have a meeting scheduled with Grant County, which is the 150 megawatt potential subscriber. I think that was this week or next week. They've got that scheduled. And then there's another Clark Public Utilities. They're anticipating to sign a letter of intent for 77 megawatts soon. So again, progress keeps being made on subscription. Not as quick as I think we'd all like or hope, but it is moving forward slowly there. So that's a quick UAMPS report, and open to any questions on any of the topics we've talked about. So
Well, I just wanted to apologize for not making it to the UAMPS conference, and hope everybody stays safe. That COVID wasn't very fun. I was out of work for 15 days.
oh wow.
And my wife and I and my brother and his wife, we were all vaccinated, and we all came down pretty ill. with COVID, the Delta variant. So just be careful out there. It's not fun.
Yeah, and that's been a challenge within our department a little bit, as well as the city in general. So yeah. So if I might ask, which vaccine did you have?
Well, my wife had one and I had the other. I got the one and done, the Johnson Johnson, and I think she had the Moderna, and I think my brother and his wife both had the Moderna, the 2 shots. But yeah, we none of us went to the hospital. My brother probably should have, but no, it's not fun, and I'm still not over it yet. I have coughs all day, so it's been a month.
Well, I'm
since I
glad
got
you're
it.
on the men's side of it, and
Yeah,
everybody stay safe.
be safe. Yeah, it's no joke.
And that's all I have. If we don't have any questions, so.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? Well, it seems like it's going to be a busy month, that's for sure. So, all righty. When do we meet again? Looking at calendar. So we meet again the 5th of October.
Yes, it looks right.
Okay. So everybody take a look at the report, and like I said, just send your questions in, and we'll hope it gets a little cooler here. And is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll go ahead and motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Okay, a second.
Meyer will
was
second it.
Randy.
Okay. So Todd motion and Randy seconded. Mark, you want to start?
How's right?
Todd,
Spriggs, aye.
Randy,
Meyer, aye.
Andy, you joined us.
Yeah, I apologize. I had some big time complications getting going and staying on, but I got most of it. But yes, I for Palmer.
Good. Dinsmore, aye. All righty, everyone. Have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you again.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Rick.